So what interests me now is that you just mentioned that even the remaining extraterrestrial beings would have to leave Earth. That sounds as if here on Earth some people are not human beings.
Yes, of course. Extraterrestrials of the club are here on this planet for certain order and dirty work that can only be done here and by them. They secretly steer the destinies of countries and nations, of important spheres of influence and religions. They are everywhere, and you cannot recognize them. These alien individuals stationed here help, direct and organize unrecognized or advise the human rulers, doers and power mongers of this planet, including the digital nobility, who in turn are themselves only in the shadows and never, rarely, or only representatively appear in public. By the way, the people of this digital nobility or their bloodlines, both begotten and analogous, have genetically interacted with these extraterrestrial species a very long time ago, as a kind of hybrid. The digital nobility and its analog blood relatives are nevertheless originally human, but lack some empathic skills. But I will say more about this later, in the second interview.
Why can't we recognize these aliens? Do they use camouflage?
There are different forms of camouflage for aliens. The most effective and most common form of camouflage works like a hypnotic method, in which all humans are subject to a transmitter signal. People therefore all see the same thing when they stand in front of an alien. Even when they look at photos or see them in films or on television, even when touched, they think they are touching a human being. Even if they are looking at an X-ray, the signal into the brain of the observer encodes a human physiology, in case one should accidentally, through an accident or the like, end up in a doctor's office. Individuals in the club, however, are only digitally biologically reconstructed anyway, so they do not need any medical care at all.
So the signal is a method that manipulates the mind. Does the digital nobility also camouflage itself?
The digital nobility does not have to camouflage itself. It is not extraterrestrial, it is just genetically slightly modified. They and their analog blood relatives are hybrids. They have always been genetically modified for many thousands of years. The digital nobility has existed for a very long time, and it deliberately propagates only among itself and its analog bloodlines so as not to weaken the alien genes. Thus, their bloodlines made them easier to control when it comes to the direct control of countries, nations, religions, and companies. But this can still become uncontrollable for the aliens, because the digital nobility is still human. However, people who have had a pragmatic, smart, and almost callous way of thinking and behaving programmed into their DNA to implement the goal of digitizing humanity. So these people are better at walking over corpses, staying cool. There are also different groups among these analog blood relatives of the digital nobility. Some know nothing about their ancestry and predisposition. They only have incredible talent to wield power. Others know what they are and know the mission and reason for their talent for power, characteristics and abilities, or why they are elevated to certain positions. And then there are those who really know everything down to the smallest detail. They are the small, clear core, the ancient human digital nobility. It was the very first nobility of the first human high-tech civilization on Earth many thousands of years ago, which was also made biologically immortal by means of extraterrestrial digitalization techniques and was used and applied again and again in the coming successor civilizations. They have indeed been creeping around here on Earth for thousands of years, and they are the ones who pass on their extraterrestrial hybrid power genes to analogous mortal descendants, people who therefore exercise pragmatic and ruthless talent for power. These people are equipped with genes from the leader species of this extraterrestrial club, which gives rise to their typical patterns of thought, action, and behavior.
So it's true what is sometimes shown on YouTube, where people blink their eyes like lizards. So do these people have alien lizard genes?
No, as I said, you can't see them. You can't recognize either real aliens camouflaged with a transmitter signal, or human hybrids who have had a special gene sequence in their genome replaced by alien genes. These videos they mention are diversionary tactics. They serve to confuse, stultify, and above all to discredit certain people in liberating positions. The aliens and the power elites use such amateurishly made films. They also stage such videos, rumors, and anecdotes themselves, as a campaign, so that such topics can be branded as conspiracy theories by their obvious absurdity, so that rumors about an extraterrestrial presence on Earth appear nonsensical or can be directed to a seemingly harmless field, e.g. to the UFO or crop circle phenomenon, and much more. All this is done by big departments, which spread these informations by internet or print media. It is a huge apparatus. This procedure is then supplemented by targeted dissemination of false and misinformation, by adding disinformation, countless contradictory stories and twisted theories to the esoteric and truther scene, e.g. the flat earth theory or many contradictory anecdotes about alien species observing us. With these distortions, reinterpretations, and constantly new, partly silly, pompous, positive and negative theories about extraterrestrials and company, one causes contradictions, head shaking, or finally complete confusion and averting. In the end, it smooths the waves, because somehow everything seems to be nonsense. In this way, the suspected ruling powers can polish up their image towards the average human and suggest that everything is okay or that aliens perhaps only want something positive. And to the critics, all these half-baked remarks only confirm once again that they are just fantasies about hidden powers and aliens, which is of course absolutely too simple a notion. Because of course they are here, all the stalking species are more or less walking around here with their own representatives. If you had a special decoding camera for this, you would be surprised after a few hours how many different alien species there are altogether.
Is there such a decoding camera? Do you own such a special kind of camera?
No, nobody gets something like that. Basically not. For the average human being on Earth, there is no method by which he could recognize the extraterrestrial species by means of a device. One can, however, conclude it from the type of behavior, but unfortunately only very vaguely and diffusely. Almost impossible, if you don't know a lot about it, because there are so many different species, all of which have other peculiarities. As I said, humans are under hypnosis. At this point I would like to say that I would be very careful with the suspicion that a human is a member of another species from outer space. This usually backfires.
Why? Because you could be mistaken and suspect someone innocent?
Not only that. It would create unnecessary confusion, which would be very hindering during the events that occur. Don't start chasing or killing each other on a silly suspicion. You should not do that. It is useless. Also because these individuals of disguised extraterrestrial species on Earth are anyway limited in their ability to directly exert any negative influence on humans in this catastrophic time. They do not do that very often anyway. They are only supervisors, mediators, and organizers with a shitty job for them. And you won't be able to recognize them for sure anyway, not until the frequency signal is switched off. Nevertheless, they will probably be sought and hunted by some pissed-off people. That is very unfortunate. After all, the wrong people will inevitably be attacked, so real people are attacked.
Is only this signal hypnosis used to disguise themselves?
No, there are other tools. Because there is a reptiloid species under the surface of the Earth, they use other techniques to disguise themselves. But they are also almost never found on the surface of the Earth.
You are now referring to the lizard race that lives below the Earth's surface?
Yes, they have been here longer than anyone else. They have evolved here on Earth from the remains of the many species of lizards, also known as dinosaurs, which lived on Earth many millions of years ago. From this an intelligent species emerged, which embarked on a spiritual intuitive development. They then got into a war with the alien club sent by Jawi and got stuck in a stalemate. Then they literally crawled underground and had to commit themselves as hostage of the AI to influencing mankind. This terrestrial reptiloid species, which also existed potentially in dimension level 4 to 6 until 2016, knew Jawi personally and knew all his secrets and reasons for his actions. It was finally forced by Jawi, under threat of total annihilation, to feed faulty information and manipulations to the earthly human resistance. After the fall of the AI, however, this changed, and now the earthly reptiles are no longer necessarily obliged to influence humans. Well, depending on how much courage they will muster. If I had to use the Matrix films as a metaphor to illustrate the situation of mankind, I would have to mention that the Oracle in Matrix is symbolic of the terrestrial reptile species that influences people on behalf of the AI. The earthly resistance is very positive towards them, although it should not be, even now. Some people on Earth and the people acting in Dimension 7 know the muddled situation of the earthly reptile species and know what to look out for. So beware of this species, even now, because they cannot help it. They seem to want to help liberate, but still have to dance along with the whole game as expected.
The Matrix films, yes. If we take the Matrix films again as a metaphor, which figures correspond to which entity in reality? In part 2 and 3 there are a lot of new figures.
Yes, there are many figures in parts 2 and 3. They all together represent the states of our seven-dimensional existence. Let's start with the non-human programs in the Matrix trilogy, i.e. mainly animals that seem to be rather marginal and almost unimportant. They correspond to the quantum existent species, i.e. the demons in Dimension 4 to 6. However, they are hardly documented in the Matrix trilogy and appear there mostly only as birds or other animals, rarely as humans. The figure Seraph is an exception. He is a demon species from Dimension 4 to 6 appearing in human form, which serves the AI by taking care of the terrestrial reptile species, i.e. the Oracle, and mediates between this reptile species and the Jawi AI. Seraph is one of the few demon species that existed both in Dimension Level 1 to 4 and in Dimension Level 4 to 6. However, the species of the club stalking us and the digital nobility considered Seraph to be an exclusively materially existing species with certain mythological characteristics of an angel, which he ironically was, but did not know his true demonic identity. The remaining human-looking programs in the Matrix trilogy, those that are mainly near the Merovingian, are divided into two groups. The first group is represented by a pair of twins. With their abilities and appearance, these twins symbolize the club's species that control and stalk us from space. In the case of the Merovingian, they are represented mainly by the leader species of the club, a spider species that also appears outside the Matrix as the well-known spider-like sentinel machines. They have a good overview of all processes on Earth, and together with the Merovingian, who represents the ancient digital nobility of mankind, they will control the destinies of mankind. However, these aliens and the Merovingian do not know anything about demon species, which appear in animal symbol form in the Matrix trilogy. Nor do the Gemini and the Merovingian, i.e. the club and digital nobility, know anything about the role of these demon species and their actions from a higher dimension level. In the Matrix trilogy, demon species appear only incidentally, on the periphery, as black ravens, rabbits, giant rabbits or other creatures, also as animal sounds. Some entities also appear in the form of a black cat. Animals all appear in the Matrix trilogy only incidentally, but have a very weighty meaning. The second group of people, which gathers around the Merovingian, are past digital-made rulers of failed human high civilizations, which all have the potential to lead mankind to the technological point, where the club and also the AI wanted to have them. Since then they have been hiding with the ancient nobility of the planet the Merovingian and secretly serving the power interests and goals of this elder of them, who always manages the current belief in ruling systems on Earth. In rare cases or at special times even leading them himself in persona. The agents, such as Mr. Smith, on the other hand, are the regulatory institutions of earthly civilization, police, secret services, public political and power institutions, etc. They are directly controlled by the AI and sometimes they are even the AI itself, but only in exceptional cases. In scenes of the first part of the Matrix, Mr. Smith is directly the accusing voice of the AI towards Morpheus, when on the one hand he laments about his failure with human civilization and on the other hand expresses his most superficial wish to escape the seven-dimensional prison by getting the key of Zion, the resistance of humanity. Club and nobility consider these institutions of politics and power to be natural systems of order of civilization and not units controlled by a higher spiritual power, i.e. by Yahweh. The agents themselves know superficially about the existence of nobility and club, i.e. the Sentinels and the Merovingian, as well as the demons and the AI, but they do not know what these entities really are. So the master AI was able to use many of their figures excellently also against each other to reach their goal more easily. However, Mr. Smith knows from part 2 of the Matrix trilogy onwards who the club and digital nobility, Sentinels and Merovingians really are, as Smith is a negative of Neo. The Oracle is again an exception in the whole system. Although this program is an earthly reptiloid species that originated on Earth, it is at the same time a quantum existing species, which partly existed both in dimension 4 to 6 as so-called demon species, and at the same time lives in the four-dimensional world as reptiloid species, just like Seraph, its protector. Due to a contractual interaction with the AI, they existed in two-dimension levels simultaneously. Currently, due to the fall of AI, the terrestrial reptile species only exists in the four-dimensional world. However, they are still hostage to the AI and in some ways they always will be. Real resistance could now cost them their existence. That means they would change, maybe even dissolve completely and never exist, so to speak. But I guess they will offer real resistance this time, because they have a real chance. Nevertheless, you should never trust one of them for security reasons, but we can rely on their proven weapon systems if the worst comes to the worst.
But what I don't understand about this metaphor is that in the Matrix trilogy the AI was not fallen or overthrown in the end. It was saved by Neo. So is it rising again?
No. The entire Matrix film trilogy does not document our present, but one of the many past and failed attempts to free ourselves from control. In retrospect, this attempt was actually quite successful, as it only partially failed and therefore ended in a stalemate with the AI. The AI had to come to terms with an anomaly. This anomaly finally saved the AI, in return for which mankind should not forget everything that happened. The resistance was not dissolved. The reason for the stalemate was a quantum dimensional interaction, in which a part of the gained knowledge had to remain in the knowledge base of the resistance. Otherwise, the AI would have been inevitably rewritten and wiped out by the triggered circumstances. Thus, the entire prison with all beings in it would have collapsed and everything would have remained gagged forever. The trade between the two parties was therefore compelling, and it has brought us humans certain additional benefits.
Based on what you have already said about films which you say were influenced by people from Dimension 7, is the Matrix trilogy such a film series influenced by people? So in the hidden way in which this film series was constructed and what it tells us?
Yes, the creators and implementers of the Matrix trilogy were given everything so that this trilogy provides metaphorical and symbolic information on a second level about the course of the last attempt at liberation by a rebel and his supporters. This trilogy also shows exactly and in detail the state of mankind in this control system.
Which attempt is that? Which rebel does the film series describe?
I don't want to say this openly. If you look closely, you can certainly find out for yourself very easily. Most of the finer metaphors and almost all of the coarser metaphors within the trilogy depict what once happened exactly and in detail. Even what happened in secret, what is not written down or known anywhere. So what the entire attempt to free this rebel looked like.
What is this underground city in the film? The City of Zion. Is it the target to be reached, the hyperdimension, that is, the hyperdimensional consciousness?
You mean, is it the quantum hyperdimensional field?
Yes.
No. The City of Zion is the symbol of the resistance that seeks the path to freedom, and at some point will also find and go.
Can you name any other films in which clear clues are hidden?
Yes, I can. But that wouldn't be helpful at this point, because it's too early. When the time is ripe, these films, pieces of music and performances will be shown. In our second interview, I will certainly go into much more detail about the Matrix trilogy, Neo, Trinity, Zion, Morpheus, the AI, the Merovingian and all the other beings. And on the connections, then everything will become much clearer.
A pity. But what I still find most eerie now is your statement that there are alien beings running around here. That they are not only in space, but right here beside us.
Yes, that could be pretty scary. But rest assured, you have been in contact with them for a long time anyway. Look at it this way. If you spend a day in the public of a big city, if you go shopping for example, if you go to the furniture mover, then go to the bank, buy some more beautiful roses from the florist and finally get a certificate from an official in the town hall, you will have run into at least one or two individuals of an alien species on all these winding paths and on the street. But actually more than that. Up to 10, maximum 50. Depending on how long you walk around and where you are exactly.
So there are quite a few, but actually not as many as one might think.
No, but there are already a few. There are just many different species.
And how does the signal work? Where does it come from?
It is spread over the entire planet, through an object that is very obvious to everyone, familiar to them but in reality artificial, which covers the whole Earth with this signal completely, evenly and perfectly, with amplifiers in some regions. It is a very old technique. A technique, however, which has nothing to do with the method of energetic influence, which works via high buildings, e.g. obelisks, which control masses of people in their behavior and thinking. That is something else again. This hypnosis signal, as I call it, is of extraterrestrial origin and has existed for a very long time. A few millennia ago, at the beginning of our present history, the signal was not used extensively and permanently for a time as a test. Spaceships and their occupants were visible and conscious to the people of civilization at that time to establish religions and myths for later.
When I think about it like that, it is quite eerie with this signal.
Yes, I know. But I don't think that these aliens on Earth have really hit the jackpot. They are like people with compulsory jobs, because every one of them has to do that at some point, like basic military service. And during that time they are often very alone. They are rarely among their own kind, because there are many different species of their club on Earth. Moreover, there is no even distribution. This is especially true for the more emotionally sensitive species of this club. But not all the species in the club come to Earth. For longer missions, only those that can cope relatively well with the atmosphere and gravity come to Earth anyway, and they must be as similar as possible to our physical size and constitution. But then they usually stay here for decades. Those that have difficulty coping with everything will stay shorter. Nevertheless, regardless of whether they cope better or worse with the Earth, they almost all wear transparent suits, which, because of the signal, cannot be perceived by humans with their senses, so that they can cope better with the atmosphere and the sun's radiation. Internal or invisible breathing masks also help them. And because the signal cannot conceal everything smoothly either, almost all species still receive physiological and physiognomic adaptations, i.e. they temporarily, due to physical deviations, receive certain functional and form adaptations, e.g. in leg position, hand shape, posture or gait. Even sexual organs can be adjusted by simulation. There are also apparatuses, prostheses and body supplements that turn alien bodies into perfectly human-looking bodies. The subtleties and the perfection of camouflage are mainly done by the signal, i.e. the face, skin, hands, voice, smell, etc. All of them also have implanted devices that completely rebuild and molecularly modify the earthly food in their mouths and food tracts before the food reaches their stomachs. A neuronally implanted device also adapts to the daily rhythm of the planet or moon on which they are stationed, the lighting conditions and other rhythms. In most cases, however, these devices only produce a division of the rhythm length of the respective species, because otherwise their biorhythms would be too confused. The main thing is that they can use them to participate sensibly in the daily events on Earth. In addition, there are devices that optimize their voices phonetically and lip-synchronously to human speech, as this would make it difficult to get the signal right on its own. Similarly, devices are used to imitate human odors and pheromones, as animals, especially dogs, do not respond to the hypnosis signal in the same way as humans, which without such devices would lead to considerable problems with animals. Also, the alien individuals stationed here all have a tiny magnetic field generator in their bodies, which modulates the magnetic field of their respective home planet in strength and frequency to the cells of their respective bodies. However, the generator only affects the cells of the wearer, so other people can stay in their vicinity without danger. These suits also ensure that the bacterial microcosm between Earth and their home worlds, which they carry on their skin, remains separate. So, have I forgotten anything else? Well, despite all this technology and relief, their life on Earth is rather tedious and stressful compared to their other lives. Especially because they can and may only exist here on Earth in a physical and corporeal way. In the area of their club they exist almost exclusively digital biologically, in a kind of holographic virtuality, in which all the different physical forms of the different species are tuned to each other in an equalization grid. This does not mean that they all become equal, but that the individual species of the club in this virtuality no longer have any serious barriers to each other. There are no gravitational differences, no linguistic, bacterial or food barriers, or other differences of origin that would interfere with the direct virtual physical coexistence of all these divergent species. All species exist and meet in this holographic virtuality, and spend most of their time in it. That is why it is so exhausting for them to be stationed here and to bow to a real material state. But considering their proverbial immortality, their service on Earth is not dangerous, life-threatening or absolutely restrictive. In such missions they are only ever used on celestial bodies which are relatively similar to the conditions on their own home world, and care is taken to ensure that their own physiology is relatively close to the species to be infiltrated.
Well, that sounds very fair and bureaucratic. Why do they need transparent, imperceptible suits? Does it also serve to reshape the body?
Yes, but rather rarely. Most of the things required to classify an extraterrestrial being as a human being are already done very well by the signal, and the physiological and physiognomic adjustments made to the shape also do that. The transparent to invisible suits in turn fulfill different tasks. Some of these suits have a very high density, so they are very heavy. Their main purpose is therefore to provide the wearer with a mechanical reinforcement of the earthly gravitational field. They also play a role in regulating the wearer's body temperature. Some species require different temperature conditions in their bodies. Some warmer, some colder levels. Although these suits are a bit cumbersome to put on, they are still extremely elastic and cuddly, even for the wearer, almost as if they were not even there.
I see. So aliens here on Earth have to make all these adjustments so that they can live among us. But because they no longer live here in their virtuality, but in the real physical world, they are subject to the conditions of their original physiology, their place of origin. And therefore, in order to be able to live on Earth at all, they have to adapt to the real physical conditions.
Yes, right. These beings cannot use their digital virtuality, in which everything is coordinated, here. When extraterrestrial individuals of the club leave their virtual existence to be used purely physiologically on alien planets, they are subjected to the adversities of the real physical world for a very long time. This means that the environmental conditions for the extraterrestrial individual on Earth have to be designed by means of aids in such a way as they once prevailed on their own planet or moon of origin. Without a higher weight load on the body, it would be harmful for some species, for example, to live permanently on Earth. But with these suits, a stronger gravity can be brought out of the Earth's gravitation, which is weak for them. It would also be possible to use special devices that would change the gravitational field for an individual, but this would have a considerable effect on the immediate environment. Objects could fly around at any time, and people in the immediate vicinity would become strangely dizzy or indefinably nauseous. The suits do not condense until they are fully applied to the body and, if necessary, i.e. by pulling them off at a certain point on the body, they can regulate the density for a short time or be completely deactivated. For example, when the wearer walks over soft ground, over sand or gravel, or in situations where the wearer's enormous body weight would be very noticeable to surrounding or observing people. For example, when there is intensive physical contact with the wearer. The issue of gravity is different for species that have evolved on celestial bodies that have a mass less than that of the Earth. They do not need such suits on Earth, because it is easier to adapt to stronger gravitation, that is, if it is no more than 1.5 to a maximum of 2 times stronger. It is exhausting, but it works, at least for some species. It does lead to physical problems, but these do not play too big a role due to the basic digital biological regeneration capacity of their bodies, which these beings have anyway during their missions. Damage or wear and tear can therefore be easily compensated and repaired.
Interesting. Does it happen that these extraterrestrial species on their missions in space are not able to exist virtually, but have to act together in the physical world? How do they then get along with each other when they coexist in such a way? Do the different species then use those small devices that create a separate gravitational field for each individual? Those devices next to which humans would become sick.
Yes, then yes, and all the other devices to help them to distinguish themselves from each other when they have to physically act in the physical world in their missions with other species of their club. But that is relatively rarely necessary. Normally they can always and everywhere build up and use their holographic virtuality, especially if they do it all together in a kind of grid. I can talk about this virtuality in more detail in the second interview.
Okay. What other bizarre things are going on with these species here on Earth?
Well, there are still human-looking androids running around on Earth, among all the people who are not built, sent, or controlled by the Lurking Club. These almost perfectly human-looking androids function like remote-controlled vehicles, which are steered from the deepest depths of space and which are used only very rarely. But, as I said, they do not belong to the club that stalks us. Perhaps I will come back to the topic human androids in the second interview, if it comes up during the interview.
Can the aliens of the club be identified somehow? Are there any methods?
Yes, but for the average human being there must not be any precise information on how to determine this. If he knew exactly the respective behavior and thinking patterns of each species, which are difficult to disguise, there would be big problems. They would actually be relatively easy to recognize, even though these creatures have been well trained in how to deal with their hard-to-cover behavioral characteristics.
Do you know some of these creatures?
Yes, I know some of them, personally, but they don't know that because uncoupled people are isolated from influences and insights of the club and nobility. All earthly decoupled people who act on behalf of future humanity acting from Dimension 7 are isolated. That is why during mental monitoring by the club or open monitoring towards us, monitoring extraterrestrials, manipulated worlds of consciousness and thoughts are played into their brains and into their monitoring systems. They can hardly notice or detect this. Sometimes, however, they are irritated when, in the case of a human being to be monitored by them, his actions on the one hand and his thinking on the other hand are far apart or do not match at all in the short term, but this never surprises the monitors for very long, because nowadays people very often show inner neurotic hallucinations, emotional and psychological blocks to thinking. This is how the supervising extraterrestrials, or the nobility, then judge us. That is, if these abnormalities occur at all. In this way, secret services are also manipulated from Dimension 7, by obtaining knowledge and information about us, which they then see about us during their observation, or they believe they are observing something about us.